In this video posted on this channel, we talked about Russia's soft power, and some of the institutions tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that Moscow goes beyond military power and economic sanctions in pursuing its interests. Public diplomacy as a component of Russia's soft power is characterized by propaganda, nation branding and foreign cultural relations. Propaganda and nation branding are largely based on disseminating information and sharing ideas with the foreign public, while cultural exchange is focused on engaging with the foreign public to establish sustainable relations. Russia's public diplomacy assumes a hierarchical model that is big on centralizing intergovernmental relations where the foreign ministry and the national diplomatic system monitor the interactions between local and international political environments. In simple terms, Russia's public diplomacy perceives people as targets who have cultural and media usage patterns as well as deep knowledge of political systems. Russian-speaking groups in the Baltics compound the effects of Russia's troubled bilateral relations as the Kremlin seeks to gain and sustain soft power in the region. From 1989 to 2011, the amount of ethnic Russians in Latvia decreased from 34% to 26.9%, in Lithuania from 9.4% to 5.4%, and in Estonia from 30.3% to 25.5%. The differences between Baltic and motherland Russians makes it difficult for Russia to formulate policies that influence Russian-speaking people. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation coordinates and supervises Russia's soft power efforts, including activities of the Central Office and the Russian embassies. Russia's foreign policies, especially towards the Baltic states, has rather been pessimistic and in similar form with the United States. The pessimistic component of the policy sheds light on the political and economic realities of the modern world that enable the formation of intensive, successful contacts. Pessimistic tendencies are founded on countries losing significance, a phenomenon that requires rethinking foreign policies. The policies made towards Russian minorities enable Russia to leverage its soft power. With regards to the Russian world, which is basically Russians in the diaspora, Moscow has to constantly modify its foreign policy discourse. Foreign policy modification requires accounting for the general attitudes of the population and comparing them with adversarial foreign agent perceptions. Russia's failure to pay close attention to Ukrainian compatriots raises questions about the compatriots elsewhere, especially far away. These questions were compounded by a decline in subscription to Russian local newspapers as outlined by Sergei Sergeyev, head of the Union of Societies of Russian Compatriots. The compatriots in the Baltics are not really consolidated since they prefer associating themselves with Europe. Politically active Russian-speaking citizens do not really influence the policies of their host country, but they are pretending to be active in order to continue receiving funding from Russia. It is difficult to determine whether the compatriots are just using Russia or Russia's negative outlook from the outside world evidenced by deteriorating relations makes it difficult to be attractive. The issue with negative public relations and frightening local authorities that minimize the efficacy of compatriots in preserving or spreading the Russian culture and language is widespread throughout the post-Soviet space, where pro-Russian identities are monopolized by certain groups since the efficiency of funds is rarely scrutinized. Russia's initiation of human rights and deliberate deprivation of citizenship in the United Nations Human Rights Council is evidence that the country could use legal means through international organizations to advance its agenda globally. The transmission of Russia's official position is not limited to the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Rosotrudnichestvo and the Ruski Mir Foundation advance Russia's soft power through nation branding and foreign cultural exchange. Rosotrudnichestvo, popularly known as the Federal Agency on CIS Affairs, Compatriots Living Abroad and International Humanitarian Cooperation, is tasked with forming objective views of modern Russia, organizing pro-Russian festivals, supporting and promoting the Russian language, exchanging cultural, scientific, and educational information, and preserving Russian history. The agency promotes public diplomacy by collaborating with others such as the Russian Association of International Cooperation, the Ruski Mir Foundation, Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation, Russian Cultural Foundation, the Union of Theatre Workers, and others. The Ruski Mir Foundation preserves and expands the Russian language, with the most recent assignment being forming and promoting a positive Russian image abroad through organizations engaged in related activities. The Baltics perceive these soft power institutions as the initiators of sabotage and espionage. Rosso-Trudnichestvo is perceived to have no difference with the British Council, Goethe Institute, USAID or Soros Foundation that advance the West's, especially America, interests globally. It is difficult to differentiate the roles of these organizations, thus making it difficult to condemn one and leave the rest. It therefore follows that all the organizations' cultural, scientific, research, and information exchange are entities that sabotage the host country. As mentioned repeatedly throughout this video, nothing is more important in Russia's soft power strategies than its language, which is central to promoting Russian culture and understanding Moscow's aspirations. The Russian language has a cultural and historical backing to the Russian state. Some sources suggest that the Russian language has been losing popularity over the recent past, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This phenomenon could be the basis for establishing the Ruski Mir Foundation and Rosso-Trudnichestvo and language and cultural centers throughout the post-Soviet space. A lot of decline in the popularity of the Russian language is associated with politics, with countries hosting compatriots being reluctant to welcome Russia's soft power since Moscow is perceived to be everything but soft. Apart from language, education has also been used to push Russian culture to change the beliefs and values of other countries. Russia, having prestigious institutions in the region, has been credited for immigration from the Baltics for citizens to be associated with such institutions. Alignment of the Baltics with the European Union implies that the goals shifts towards wanting to be associated with Western education and associating prestige with related institutions. The history of the Baltics, especially the perception of the events of the 20th century as irreconcilable, has placed the member states in a state of confusion globally. Basically, the Russian culture and education are very fundamental for Moscow's soft power. But, can Russia ever be soft? The Russian Foreign Ministry has largely focused on changing international order, the one established after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Moscow perceives as unstable, unfair, and irrational. According to Russia's foreign concept policy, financial and economic challenges become increasingly evident as negative trends build up in the world economy. Unsolved structural problems and lingering economic depression in the leading countries of the West affect global development in a negative way. Incomplete recovery amidst the European debt crisis and ongoing recession trends in the euro area pose serious risks for the future. Another risk to world peace and stability is presented by attempts to manage crises through unilateral sanctions and other coercive measures, including armed aggression, outside the framework of the UN Security Council. There are instances of blatant neglect of fundamental principles of international law, such as the non-use of force, and of the prerogatives of the UN Security Council when arbitrary interpretation of its resolutions is allowed. Some concepts that are being implemented are aimed at overthrowing legitimate authorities and sovereign states under the pretext of protecting civilian population. The use of coercive measures and military force bypassing the UN Charter and the UN Security Council is unable to eliminate profound socio-economic, ethnic and other antagonisms that cause conflicts. Such measures only lead to the expansion of the conflict area, provoke tensions and arms race, aggravates interstate controversies and incite ethnic and religious strife. The Kremlin perceives the existing international order as structurally subjugating Russia, with the capabilities of independent actions being shaped by the inequalities experienced in the global stage. The objective for Eastern Europe encompasses creating alternatives to rules created by the West, which is perceived as external, and expanding those rules throughout the post-Soviet space. This post-Soviet space is very important for Russia's international strategy. The difficulty and efficiency of using hard power, as evidenced by the case of Ukraine, has made it necessary for Russia to use subtler approaches to gaining and maintaining power. Soft power in the case of Russia, as with everyone else, builds on the potential presented by the civil society, traditional diplomacy, information, culture, and other components of international relations. According to the previously highlighted foreign concept policy, Russia follows a policy aimed at creating a stable and sustainable system of international relations based on international law and principles of equality, mutual respect, and non-interference in internal affairs of states. The system aims to provide reliable and equal security for each member of the international community in the political, military, economic, informational, humanitarian, and other areas. The hard and soft power components of Russia's foreign policy are always up for debate, especially considering Russia's history of relying on propaganda to influence internal and external masses. The whole concept of soft power is new to Russia and its neighbors who have constantly been subjected to hard power. International problems involving Russia have largely been resolved through force. As addressed by the concept, increasing global competition and the growing crisis potential sometimes creates a risk of destructive and unlawful use of soft power and human rights concepts to exert political pressure on sovereign states, interfere in their internal affairs, destabilize their political situation, manipulate public opinion, including under the pretext of financing cultural and human rights projects abroad. The Russian leadership, from politicians to critical thinkers, perceive soft power as a sign of weakness, with its strength and ideology being routinely measured with instruments of hard power. Soft power in the context of Russia routinely supplements real, hard power, evidenced by one of the most common proverbs in Russia which says, "The only real allies of Russia are its army and its fleet," which regained popularity after many of so-called partners turned away during the Ukrainian crisis. This attitude really caught on, especially at the beginning of Putin's second term, when the Baltics joined. Russia rarely thinks regionally and locally, with the focus being on international politics, thereby ignoring smaller players with the exclusive focus on big players, a phenomenon that has really hindered the effective implementation of Russia's foreign policy. Russia is well aware of the power of social media in the context of information dissemination and that soft instruments might replace the hard ones. In light of this, Russia Today and the Voice of Russia network have been revived. The media uses current Russia's soft power and seeks to create modern tools of implementing and transforming the power into influence. Examination of Russian media is commonly objective and subjective, with the object of the examination being Russia's identity while the subject largely revolving around Russia's perception inside and outside Russia. The Russian media has a complicated role, a role more complicated than its Western counterparts, owing to the fact that Russia's attractiveness, especially in the post-Soviet space, is actively shaped as opposed to passively possessed. Thus, the media is tasked with the role of creating the power as opposed to leveraging already existing potential. The lack of resources in the case of Russian media really shows when they try influence a target's point of view using the definitio-negatio approach that seeks to explain what Russia is not as opposed to what it actually is. This approach largely focuses on constantly comparing Russia with the West, especially America and European Union. The most observable issue with the approach used by the Russian media is disparities between the Russian image and its reality, which informs the label of Russian propaganda by the Western media, if you ever wondered where that term came from. Ethical categories and moral criteria are fundamental in political fights, but the effectiveness of their use is of limited importance to the Russian media because of the conclusion that implementers use the weaknesses of one player as their strong points. The confrontation between Russian media and like everyone else doesn't exactly mean that one side is right and the other is wrong. Examining Russia's approach to being attractive, especially within its region, requires considering the terming of the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century as an irrational historical and geopolitical fact. The West-controlled belt on the north-south axis from the Baltic to the Black Seas that divides Europe and Russia is commonly perceived as a geopolitical division and an unnatural state of affairs. These perceptions inform Russia's strategies in Eastern Europe, with the target being convincing citizens in the region that the current situation is unstable and dangerous owing to the resultant geopolitical factors. Russia and its perceptions of the post-Soviet space as one big country explains why there were no strategies in the region for over 2 decades. The recent shift of these countries to move closer to the West served as a wake-up call for Moscow, with the Kremlin considering the shift as impossible and impractical. This phenomenon accounts for Russia's perceptions of the European Union and the West intruding in its territory. Russian media is used by different groups for varied reasons, which are primarily centered on pushing socio-political ideologies. The control of Russian media is a fierce internal fight. The groups seeking to control Russian media are described differently, from populist, xenophobic post-Marxist nativists, to dominant realist groups that think Russia should only focus on relationships with major powers and forget about all the rest, to selective multilateralism groups that believe Russia should expand its self-influence among small and emerging powers, or commonly referred to as the developing world, to globalists who believe that Russia should be involved in solving a wide range of global issues as an approach to increasing its presence in the global stage. The globalists have already lost the debate, just like in China, because of the Ukrainian and Taiwan crises that present the two powers as clutched in an objective and unavoidable zero-sum competition. Following America's world domination at the end of the 90s, Russian strategists, image makers, and political advisors focused on loyalty to the Kremlin as the only way to resist American influence. This focus was accompanied by active measures in the context of information policy that sought to minimize Western influence on Russians as much as possible, accomplish an ideological reconquista of the post-Soviet space, and influence people beyond the front lines by creating instruments that reach out to citizens in the Western powers. The objectives surrounding Russia's ideologies in the post-Soviet space are quite difficult to accomplish because making people love Russia is not a walk in the park, but getting it done would place Russia at the center of the regional balance. The battle for the grey zone of Europe that was institutionalized by joining the European Union and NATO has presented the ultimate geopolitical reality. It is becoming increasingly important for Russia to win the hearts and minds of people, especially in this age where hard power is ideal as in the case of repelling aggression but is undesirable when seeking partners in global politics. Russia has constantly focused on winning back the most immediate members of the post-Soviet space, most notable being Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. However, the constant war of information and ideology between Russia and the West has been central to the confusion in the post-Soviet space on which side of international politics the states should align with. Russia has been welcoming to states that hold a position favorable to the Kremlin, as in the case of Belarus, while it has gone on to exercise hard power on states that have stances favoring the West, as in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, the West in this case being symbolized largely by the European Union and NATO. This use of hard power in instances where states do not align with Russia is precisely why it is difficult for the country to gain and sustain soft power. The Baltics are seen as lost territories because of the EU and NATO member that Russia cannot do so much about without pissing a few people off. However, weaknesses arising from divisions in the EU regarding matters of international concern, most recently being the implementation of sanctions against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, the decline of America's popularity in certain places across the world, as well as in international organizations, and the perceived NATO weakness, all offer temptations to Russia to swing the international scale towards itself. BRICS is certainly one way Russia is going about creating an international organization that is not centered on the West. The general geopolitical picture and regional specificities guide the Russian information strategy, whose objective include informing the population, forming the Russian image, reforming the media space, and transforming the cultural and mental identity. Russian media outlets seek to pluralize the international media space that is largely dominated by the West. The strategies underlying the entrance of the Russian media into the global media space seek to challenge the Western quasi-monopoly for global narrative by introducing a Russian point of view and legitimizing the Russian message. Russia is now the go-to alternative for people tired of Western-dominated anything, including news. Russian media, both locally and abroad, seeks to create some skepticism around the West as their media outlets cast doubts on the Russian image. The whole interest of Russia in communication channels around the world revolves around taking control of its image. Russia, in the contexts of its friends, presents itself as a better version of the American or the European dream, which is less attractive as expected. Listening to Russian media creates the perception that Russia's happy community of unlimited resources is only accessed when a state is friendly to the Kremlin, thereby not being close to the West, especially NATO and the European Union. Those against Russia's foreign policy are presented as irresponsible international players and shown the tough face that promises punishment. Russia's stick-and-carrot approach, which includes threats and rewards, to international politics is a social contract that Russia places in good graces with the Kremlin at a point of privileged responsibility. Russia's interest with information also revolves around reforming the reality of its image, especially in its region, then gradually growing to the outside world. The Kremlin perceives the choice of Russia's neighbors to align with the West as an unnatural imbalance and a campaign to contain Russian influence in its region. This phenomenon explains why the Russian media space is the next stop for a geopolitical showdown between the Kremlin and the West. Russia believes that the West manipulates Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Moldovans by the promise of a better future if they cut ties with Russia, kinda what Russia promises if they cut ties with the West. Basically, Russia and the West are not that different, except for the fact that the West is not overly reliant as Russia on hard power in instances where international actors do not align with their beliefs or interests. Then it all comes down to who controls the information space because they're more likely to be perceived as genuine. The increased support for Western-backed international organizations, especially the European Union and NATO, implies that Russia is gradually losing the mental battle in its backyard. It is important for Russia to create a positive image of itself as it was the case in the Soviet era where most inhabitants were loyal to the Union. A positive image would eliminate the gray area that the West constantly exploits, but the same recurrent problem: rarely does Russia engage using diplomacy. You either agree with the Kremlin or they're packing tanks on your borders for a special military operation. Russian media offers the Kremlin an opportunity to exercise soft power, but the invasions have to stop because they make it difficult to form some form of relationship based on the elements of soft power, including language and culture. Russia and the Russian media needs to focus on transformative power, that is, get to a point where its existence in any conversation should be able to change strategic and political attitudes. The Russian media is well aware that focusing on Soviet nostalgic pensioners would be like preaching to the converted, as well as the limitations presented by time and biology on the social and political influence in the region. The ultimate goal for Russian media is to widen the audience that is influenced by Russia, which is based on how fast neighbors and other targeted audiences consume Russian content. The primary audience is Russian patriots who never expected to live outside the Soviet Union. A lot of Russians perceive the sovereignty of its neighbors as a geopolitical anomaly, and as such, they find it difficult to not speak Russian even when outside the motherland or requiring visas to see their relatives. Radical Russians, especially those in the motherland, do not take the sovereignty of their neighbors seriously, and there is the general belief that they will one day come home. Russians also believe that if everything goes south, the Kremlin will always come through for compatriots and would never leave them out there. Compared to newly formed republics, Russia was less attractive after the collapse of the Soviet Union because of the hope of independence beyond the Union. The second group targeted by Russian media is non-Russians who speak Russian and have access to their culture. Common sense dictates that if one wasn't born in Russia but they speak Russian, then they're interested in Russia as a country because they put in some work. Targeting this second group of people seeks to widen Russia's influence because speaking Russian is associated with greater access to the underlying culture and great civilization value. Westerners perceive the Russian culture as different and fascinating, which informs seeking Russian history, literature, opera, Russian people, landscapes, and architecture, all of which is documented in Russian. All the people who speak Russian are largely considered to be the Russian world, that is, people who adhere to Russia's patrimony. The widespread use of the English language is a massive problem for Russia and challenging that would take quite the bold step. This phenomenon explains the interest in the non-Russians who speak the language because the group has been expanded, thereby validating the need for the Russian media to collaborate with Russotrudnichestvo. The toughest group targeted by Russian media consists of people who are neither born in Russia or exposed to the Russian language by choice. The general objective by the Russian media is to reach the level of popularity that was enjoyed by the Western states of the USSR. Russian strategists are not exactly happy with the negative portrayal of Russia in global politics which they attribute to the Western media. In the context of the Russian media, it is their responsibility to tell the truth to people, which is the different interpretation of information from the West. The Russian media understands that it is impossible for everyone to like Russia, ask the Ukrainians and Georgians following the recent invasions, so the goal is, just like every other strategy in the global stage, to provide alternatives to the West to break the monopoly. Knowing about the presence of Russian media ascertains that right and wrong is not determined by Fox and CNN only. For a decade following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is the late 90s to the early 2000s, the Russian Federation did not have control over the information written about them. Regaining the citizenry of the Russian Federation is obviously followed by changing external perceptions. The strategies used by Russian media to create a positive image of Russia and suppress negative images include blocking, discrediting, blurring the negative, distracting attention, distracting resources, trolling, reaching the absurd, and active defense. Blocking, which entails protecting a certain group of people from some pieces of information, is quite difficult in this age of global information sharing, especially social media. Local authorities in Russia maintain political relations perceived as profitable to block anti-Russia propaganda, the name given to Western content, from reaching the masses. The fact that blocking is difficult and sometimes counterproductive implies that the strategy is only useful for information generated inside Russia. Discrediting information is common in instances where the information in question is a threat to Russian interests. The whole discrediting process entails invalidating the credibility of the source by claiming malice or unreliability. Emphasis is placed on accusations while completely ignoring justifications because they make aggressive allegations reach new audiences. Blurring the negative entails disseminating a huge amount of content to cover up potentially damaging information. The damaging information is kind of diluted by large volumes of neutral or positive information, thereby diverting the masses' attention. Distraction always proves useful in instances where existing information is difficult to disbelieve. Distracting information is more interesting to the point of capturing viewers' attention, thereby diverting it from unfriendly media. Russian media believes that the narratives inside and outside Russia have placed the country in constant defense, which has made it difficult to control its own narrative. The top Russian class is uncomfortable with all their distractions being constantly directed towards democratic freedoms, human rights, corruption, or minority rights. Russia believes that there are greater concerns, and as such, the media is responsible for pushing priority discussions. Russia has constantly cast doubt on Western-backed institutions' concerns about issues like human rights, citing political malice, which it justifies with the constant information attacks. Moscow has not made the lives of Westerners any easier by creating uncomfortable information themes that cannot be ignored by the media. Russia effectively switches attention from itself by engaging hostile resources elsewhere. Trolling seeks to make information repulsive enough to generate, quote, allergic reactions from the masses. The best example of Russian media trolling Westerners would be the Saki case, where the State Department spokesperson was distinguishable and presented as a symbol of ignorance, loftiness, inanity, and thoughtless Russophobia. Western media only presents their host nation's good side, while Russia seeks to balance this with what it calls the objective truth, as opposed to engaging in a smear campaign against the West. Countering hostile information is largely based on challenging the credibility and pushing it towards absurdity. Russia still remains a closed and undiscovered country, and as such, target audiences rarely revise information. This approach is used by Russia to challenge massive information attacks against itself by presenting the West as paranoid Russophobes who know nothing about Russia. It's impossible to constantly counter negative information about Russia, but it is possible to limit the size of exposure to defects. Active defense entails suppressing the reason for negative information before it emerges, because enemies search for vulnerabilities before soiling Russia's image. The media can only talk about reality, but cannot change it. Thus, being attractive in the case of Russia requires a consensus among the Russian elite on how to approach international politics without harming its security and sovereignty.